So what I'm going to talk about today is nitrogen fertilizer manufacturing. And I guess the first thing to understand is that all the raw nitrogen used to make all the nitrogen fertilizer in the world just comes out of the air. So the air is about 78% nitrogen. So when you're buying a ton of urea, you're buying air that's come from Qatar or China or Canada or wherever else, but that's where the main ingredient comes from. So nitrogen itself is not the limiting factor to make nitrogen fertilizer. That's the easy part of it. Just really quickly, people would be aware, particularly farmers, of the volatility of nitrogen. Now, when the Straits of Hormuz closed down, that restricted global nitrogen supply by about 20%. And on top of that, we saw prices nearly doubling. So small supply chain constraints can, I guess, be amplified into larger cost on the ground outcomes. And what I just wanted to quickly just show you is that historically for the last 100 years, effectively most of the nitrogen that's been produced has been used as fertilizer. So in 2024, we produced about, as the world, about 200 million tonnes of ammonia, which is like the precursor to urea and so forth. And 183 million of that 200 was used for fertilizer. So there's a very small percentage going to other things like cleaning fluids and explosives and a few other bits and pieces. But there's extra demand, significant extra demand coming, mostly from the energy sector, where ammonia is to be used as a co-firing agent, particularly in coal-fired power stations in Asia, and also for global maritime shipping. There's already more than 100 large-scale vessels on order by large shipping companies to use ammonia fuel. And at the moment for co-firing, Japan is already looking to use 30 million tonnes. So if you look at our current production of 20 million tonnes and the Strait of Hormuz sort of mopping up 20% of that in the price impacts, Japan's going to take 15% and Korea's not far behind them. So by 2050, the estimated demand for ammonia is up near 700 million tonnes. Now, what we know is that supply usually follows demand. So what we're going to see is probably price volatility all the way through from here to 2050, with prices going up to a point where someone wants to build extra supply, and then prices will flatten out for a bit, then prices will go up until someone wants to build extra supply. So fertilizer has been the dominant force and the dominant pricing aspect behind nitrogen fertilizer, but that's changing. How far it goes or whatever, I don't know. But if it goes as far as has been forecast, then we could be in for some problematic outcomes in the market. So what we're looking at then is saying, how can we divert the current supply chain? Because if the nitrogen is just in the air, how can we make our own? And this is a journey we've been on for some years. And one technology that Don wanted me to speak about today was non-thermal plasma, which is basically making a nitrate solution out of the air. Just to quickly run through a couple of figures, is that in terms of the energy that's required to turn nitrogen in its form in the air, which is N2, into a form of nitrogen that plants can use, such as ammonium or nitrate, we can put an energy factor to that per kilo of nitrogen that's actually fixed. So the theoretical minimum for making ammonia via the Haber-Bosch process, which is the current industrial process, been around for about 110 years now, it's about 7 kilowatts to produce 1 kilo of N. Now, when that first came out and was being industrialized in the 20s and 30s, it was around 34, so it wasn't very efficient. And now we've brought that down to about 10. So we're not very far away from the theoretical efficiency. Now, when you look at non-thermal plasma for ammonia, the current industry claims are around about 24. So what's interesting about that is it's still at the higher end. We're talking about a technology that's been around for about 5 years, 10 years tops, and still has a lot of room for improvement. And I'll talk to some of that in a minute. Now, back in about 2020, we coined the term lightning in a bottle because lightning does a similar action, but it's very inefficient because it's producing a lot of noise and heat and other things. But the theoretical minimum amount of energy to fix nitrogen into the nitrate form using non-thermal plasma is actually very low. It's only 4 kilowatts per kilo of N, which is not quite half of the ammonia Haber-Bosch process, but it's lower than what we have been doing. But we've still got a much larger gap between what we can do commercially and what's theoretical, because obviously the technology hasn't been around as long, it hasn't been as refined and optimized as much. So someone's produced a paper, and there's a reference here in the slides, but about what that would need to be competitive with traditional nitric acid, which is our pathway to ammonium nitrates, calcium ammonium nitrates, and other nitrates. We'd probably need to be about 20 kilowatts per kilo of N to at least be starting to get within the ballpark. And at the moment, the conventional machinery is around about 40, so about double where it needs to be. I kind of look at solar power 35 years ago or so when it first came out. It was very inefficient, had lots of technical issues, but now these days, over 30 years of developments, it's become quite good. So I think the main message here is that this theoretically can be very good, but it's still got a ways to go. So what we did in around about, I think, 2021 or so, was actually to buy a plasma arc. So this is a pre-commercial, before the company started offering the Lightning technologies commercially. We got an arc and we installed it in a winery at Kultala Wines at Auburn in Clare Valley. And basically we ran that for a year just to see what would happen. And we did that in conjunction also with the Hessel Research Group at Adelaide Uni. I guess our main outtakes with that was that it looks good. There's these little lightning arcs you can see there. This is the Plasma Leap 100 technology. I think Plasma Leap, out of all the manufacturers, have a very good system in as much that this bubble reactor they've got creates a very high surface area. So very small bubbles, has a very high surface area between the air and the water, where this ionization is occurring. So that's what it looks like on the inside of the machine. What we learnt though is that the peripherals on these machines are very important. So things like water pumps and air pumps, because if they fail, your core equipment can get damaged, and the core equipment is very expensive. So want to make sure that your peripherals are very high quality, that are built for continuous operation in variable conditions, like when it gets hot in summer and so forth. In terms of nitrogen output, I'll talk to that in a sec, but there's definitely room for improvement. It was probably lower than we were hoping for. It also makes a pretty dilute solution, so the liquid storage is something you have to think through. We were using 1,000-litre shuttles, and we just had so much algae growing in them because 1 to 2% nitrogen solution is ideal for algae. If you can get to 25 or 27 like UAN and things like that, up into the 30s and 40s, it's not a drama, because the algae can't live in those sort of concentrations, but in the low concentrations they love it. The other thing is that over time the nitrogen content of that liquid can reduce with the NO2 minus pathway to nitric oxide. So we want to limit the ventilation and the headroom in those sort of storage vessels as well. So that will sort of inhibit the off-gas production and escape. So what we're looking at here in this graph is very basic non-thermal plasma output for nitrates, ammonium, and it also produces hydrogen peroxide. I think the hydrogen peroxide is actually having an effect. Where we're seeing this working the best is generally in higher rainfall areas. And I think the nitrogens may be contributing something as well, but in itself, hydrogen peroxide is an oxidizing agent. And because very wet environments can get anaerobic, having an oxidizing agent sort of takes some of the stress out of the anaerobic condition. But also under the USDA, if you search hydrogen peroxide, you'll also see it's actually a pretty good fungicide at very low concentrations. So maybe it's also doing something else as well. What we wanted to look at was, could we improve those figures? And what we see here is 3 different techniques of using the plasma arc, where once we've just got a batch there for 20 minutes and we've made 3.3 units of N in effect. What we've got is recycling for 20 minutes and we've gone to 5.8 units of N, and then we're recycling it for an hour and we've gone to around about 12.8 units of N. So if we bring that back to an N per minute, which is effectively an N per kilowatt, we can see that just doing a batch for 20 minutes is 0.165. recycling using exactly the same amount of electricity, but just changing the mechanism, we're at 2.90. So that's a pretty significant increase just by changing the way the machine operates. And if we recycle and recycle and recycle for a longer period of time, we find that we hit some sort of peak, and then we'll have a case of diminishing returns where it seems that having some of the ions in the water helps form more ions, but it reaches a state of saturation where the plasma arc actually then starts to destroy the ions that it's made because they're just too concentrated in the solution. So when we look at trying to handle volume in the commercial machines at the moment, generally that's multiple arcs that are in parallel. We think there's a strong case to move that to put them in series, so and significantly increase the output. The other thing we looked at was catalysts. Most machines at the moment don't come with a catalyst, and we used a number of different catalysts, but this catalyst that performed really well was actually a very highly available, very cheap catalyst. It's just an iron catalyst, and it increased the nitrate production by about 40% as well, going from 84 units up to 118 units. So we can see significant upside, like just by recycling it rather than doing it as a batch, we're seeing 40% increase in production. By adding a catalyst, we're seeing another 40% increase in production. They're going to be additive or not. There's other questions to be asked there that we haven't worked out yet. But what we can see here is there's significant room for improvement. Now, there's a bunch of different companies that make this technology. We're currently looking at some in detail to look at their actual end use efficiency in terms of how much electricity they use per unit of N, and also their carbon footprint in production per unit of N. All right, I'm now just going to switch over to a completely different way of making nitrogen fertilizers, which is out of biomass. The first thing I'd say is that there's obviously some people in the room here that know a bit of my history, and I spent a long time looking at stubble retention and different headers and different stubble management techniques and whether baling is a good thing for soils or not, and those sort of things. And I'm very much a pro stubble retention guy. But in saying that, if the numbers are relatively low in terms of having to offtake biomass, then I guess it's something that's worth having a look at. So the biomasses that work really well are when you've got a centralized processing like almonds, and you've got almond husks and everything's already been moved to a site. Straw removal requires close evaluation because you've got your transport and it's a secondary operation, then you've got your soil perspectives. And in these types of things, having uniform feedstock is usually a bit easier to manage, but you can manage a whole lot of biomass as well as urban waste in these types of machines. Biomass as a ratio of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen is about 1 carbon to 1.6 hydrogens. And I should just say here that really hydrogen yield is the critical path to making ammonia and then urea. So hydrogen yield is basically a surrogate for how much urea we can make. So if we take biomass and think about it as a poor cousin to natural gas or a poor cousin to coal, is that we can apply technologies that have been around for quite some time. And the first one is the biomass to syngas. So basically we're taking that hydrocarbon oxygen mix and turning it into carbon monoxide and hydrogen. So that hydrogen can be shunted out of there and put straight into an ammonia manufacturing process. But with the carbon monoxide, we use something called the water gas shift reaction, and I'm going to just talk about that in a sec. Now, once you've got all your hydrogen, you mix it with ammonia out of the air through a process called the Haber-Bosch synthesis, which has been around for ages. Nobel Prize in 1919 for inventing it effectively and getting it to work, and another Nobel Prize in 1931 for commercializing and upscaling it. And then people then put the urea synthesis on the back of that. So one important consideration is that to make urea, in addition to ammonia, you also need carbon dioxide. So with this biomass gasification type of technology, scale does matter. You can't build this at small scale. This is me looking at a straw to electricity plant in Spain a bit over 10 years ago. This runs at about 125,000 tonnes of biomass a year. The reason why the water gas shift reaction is really important is that if you look at natural gas, that's CH4. So there's 1 carbon to 4 hydrogens. So you can get a lot of hydrogen off in stripping out the raw material, and then you can run the water gas shift reaction on the carbon monoxide that's left over. But because we don't have as much hydrogen in biomass, we do make a lot of carbon monoxide, it becomes an important source of hydrogen by doing the water gas shift reaction, is whereby we add water to carbon monoxide and we get hydrogen to come out with carbon dioxide. So it's basically stripping the hydrogen off of water in a very cost-effective, very well understood. Again, this is a reaction that's been around for over 100 years and is one of the most used reactions in the world. So all the equipment and understanding of this reaction is very well understood. If we look at the hydrogen in a bale of straw, per tonne of straw, it's about 60 odd kilos of actual hydrogen. So if we were using a technique that was getting the hydrogen out, we'd always end up with less than 60 kilos because there's only 60 kilos in the actual straw. So we might end up with 20 or 40 kilos of hydrogen from a bale of straw. However, by using the water gas shift reaction, we can produce more hydrogen that's in the straw. We can basically double it. And by doing that, we're getting much more efficiency to create double as much hydrogen out of the same bale of straw. And then, of course, hydrogen flows directly into ammonia and then into urea. Now, the carbon dioxide that comes out of the water gas shift reaction is what we use to make the urea. It doesn't actually use that much water. It's about less than 3 tonnes of water per tonne of urea. And 3 tonnes of water cost is about less than $10 according to SA Water's current connection fees. So yeah, significantly increasing urea production at $10, that makes sense. So looking around the world, biomass to syngas has been around for years. It was used a lot in World War II, both in England and also in Germany. Thousands of vehicles were made to run on wood chip. So effectively they would produce the syngas, but instead of turning that into urea or whatever, they would send that to an internal combustion engine to replace petrol. We look at the plant in the middle, the blue and yellow plant there. That is a biomass to syngas plant in Finland. And now we're starting to see a lot of stuff in a pretty dynamic space where we have basically customizable reactors coming out with things like the water gas shift reaction already built into them. There's currently 2 major projects in Australia looking at biomass to urea. One's in Gladstone. That's looking to take 265,000 tonnes of biomass. That will include urban organic waste and some other things, but also some straws and wood and some stuff like that. So with 265,000 tonnes of biomass, they want to produce 220,000 tonnes of urea, and they have an offtake agreement for all of that. So most of that will go to AdBlue. But if you look at 265,000 tonnes of biomass to 220,000 tonnes of urea, that's a conversion ratio of 83%. So if you were to take 1 tonne of biomass, dry biomass, you'd end up with 830 kilos of urea, or 1.25 tonnes and end up with about a tonne of urea. The other project is a bit smaller. It's targeting 120,000 tonnes of biomass, and it's forecasting 100,000 tonnes of urea, which again is that 83% conversion ratio. Out of it, you also get your ash back. So your ash will have your potassium. We're not actually burning it, so don't think about this ash as what's left over after burning, but more or less it kind of is, even though the process is not burning. But that's going to have things like your zinc, your coppers, your moly, potassium, phosphorus, and all those sort of things in it. And you can just return that back to the field. If you use municipal waste, then that can be contaminated and brings in a whole lot of other issues. So just looking at, if we were to say, for example, be very conservative and say that we were going to convert 4 tonnes of straw into 1 tonne of urea, that's a 25% conversion ratio. So basically, if you were in this scenario where you were using 150 kilos of urea to produce a grain crop of 3.5 tonnes that were producing, 5 to 7 tonnes of straw, if you were to cut out 4 tonnes of straw, and at that 25% conversion ratio, in effect, you'd need to bale around 15% of the farm area at that 4 tonne ratio to get 100% of the fertiliser for that farm.